Thomas Whitmore had been guarding the royal family for 12 years. His days started before dawn and ended long after the sun had set. Every morning, he would stand at his post outside Prince George's private quarters, watching for any sign of trouble. His uniform was always perfect, his shoes polished to shine like mirrors, and his face showed the serious expression of a man who took his job very seriously. The young prince was now 15 years old, no longer the small boy who used to wave at Thomas from his bedroom window. George had grown tall and quiet, spending most of his time reading books or staring out at the palace gardens. Thomas noticed how the prince seemed different from other teenagers. While most boys his age were loud and playful, George carried himself with a strange heaviness that made Thomas worry. On this particular Tuesday morning, Thomas took his usual position outside the prince's room. The hallway was quiet except for the soft ticking of an old grandfather clock. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating long shadows on the polished marble floor. Thomas had learned to love these peaceful moments before the day officially began. Prince George's door opened exactly at 7:30, just like every other day. The young prince stepped out wearing his school uniform, his dark hair neatly combed and his blue eyes looking tired. He nodded at Thomas with a small smile, the same greeting they had shared every morning for years. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas said with a respectful bow of his head. "Morning, Thomas," George replied softly. His voice had changed over the past year, becoming deeper, but somehow sadder too. As they walked together toward the dining room, Thomas noticed something different about the prince's walk. Usually, George moved with purpose even if he was quiet. Today, his steps seemed slower, more thoughtful. The prince kept looking back, over his shoulder, as if he was trying to remember something important. The palace corridors were filled with other staff members preparing for the day. Maids dusted furniture that was already spotless, gardeners brought in fresh flowers for the vases, and kitchen staff hurried past carrying silver trays. Everyone nodded respectfully when they saw Prince George, but Thomas could see that the boy barely noticed them. At breakfast, the prince sat alone at the long dining table. His parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had left early for royal duties in Scotland. George pushed his food around his plate without really eating, staring out the window at the garden where peacocks walked across the perfectly trimmed grass. Thomas stood by the door watching carefully. In all his years of service, he had learned to read the moods of the royal family members he protected. Today, something was definitely bothering Prince George. The boy's usual polite conversation with the servants was replaced by long silences. Even when the cook brought his favorite jam for his toast, George barely looked up to say thank you. After breakfast, they walked to the car that would take the prince to school. Thomas always rode in the front seat while George sat in the back with his school books. During the drive through London, Thomas watched the prince in the rearview mirror. George was not looking at his phone or reading like he usually did. Instead, he was staring straight ahead with an expression that Thomas had never seen before. At the school gates, crowds of photographers and reporters waited with their cameras ready. This was normal, but today Prince George seemed to notice them more than usual. He watched them through the car window for a long time before getting out. When he finally stepped onto the sidewalk, the cameras flashed like lightning, but George did not wave or smile like he sometimes did. He just walked straight into the school building. Thomas spent the day parked outside the school, as he always did. He read newspapers and listened to radio reports about royal events happening around the world. Sometimes other security guards would come over to chat, but today Thomas felt too worried to make conversation. Something about Prince George's behavior that morning kept bothering him. When school ended, Thomas watched the building entrance carefully. Prince George was usually one of the first students to come out, eager to return to the palace. Today, he was one of the last. When he finally appeared, he was walking with his head down, carrying his backpack over one shoulder. The other students around him were laughing and talking loudly, but George moved through them like he was invisible. The drive back to the palace was completely silent. George did not ask about his schedule for the evening or mention anything about his classes. Thomas wanted to ask if everything was all right, but royal protocol meant he could only speak when the prince spoke to him first. The silence in the car felt heavy and uncomfortable. Back at the palace, Prince George went straight to his room and closed the door. Thomas took his position in the hallway, but instead of the usual sounds of music or television from inside the room, there was complete quiet. This worried Thomas even more. The prince usually spent his afternoons doing homework while listening to music or video calling with friends from school. As the hours passed, Thomas began to realize that this was not just a bad day for the young prince. The way George had looked at everything that morning, the careful attention he paid to things he normally ignored, and the deep sadness in his eyes all suggested something much more serious was happening. Evening came and still no sound came from Prince George's room. The dinner bell rang, but the prince did not come out. Thomas knocked gently on the door and announced that dinner was ready, but George called back that he was not hungry. This was very unusual, as the prince never missed meals. Thomas stood in the hallway as darkness fell outside the palace windows. The other guards changed shifts, but Thomas chose to stay late. Something told him that this night would be different from all the others, and he wanted to be there if Prince George needed anything. He had no idea that tomorrow would bring a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The next morning brought no improvement in Prince George's mood. Thomas arrived at his post to find the prince's breakfast tray sitting untouched outside his door from the night before. This had never happened in all the years Thomas had been working at the palace. Royal family members were taught from birth about the importance of proper meals and routine. Thomas knocked softly on the door. "Your Highness, shall I have the kitchen prepare fresh breakfast for you?" There was a long pause before George's voice came through the door, muffled and tired. "No, thank you, Thomas. I will be out shortly." When the door finally opened, Thomas was shocked by what he saw. Prince George's usually perfect appearance was completely disheveled. His hair was messy, his clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. It was clear that the young prince had not slept well, if at all. "Are you feeling unwell, Your Highness?" Thomas asked with genuine concern. "Perhaps we should call the palace doctor." George shook his head slowly. "I am fine, Thomas. Just tired." But Thomas could see that this was not just tiredness. The prince's hands were shaking slightly, and he kept taking deep breaths as if he was trying to calm himself down. As they walked through the palace corridors, George moved even more slowly than the day before, stopping occasionally to look at paintings on the walls or out the windows. At one point, Prince George stopped completely in front of a large portrait of his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth. He stared at the painting for several minutes, his expression unreadable. Thomas waited patiently, wondering what thoughts were going through the young prince's mind. "She was very brave, was not she, Thomas?" George asked suddenly. "Yes, Your Highness. Her Majesty was known for her courage and dedication throughout her reign." George nodded slowly. "Even when she was young like me. She knew what she had to do, even when it was difficult." Thomas was not sure how to respond to this comment. It seemed like the prince was working through some kind of internal struggle, but Thomas could not understand what it might be about. When they reached the breakfast room, Prince George sat down but again did not eat much. He picked at his eggs and toast while staring out at the garden. The peacocks were walking across the lawn again, their beautiful feathers catching the morning sunlight. "Thomas," George said suddenly, "do you ever wonder what it would be like to be free to make your own choices about your life?" This question surprised Thomas. "I suppose everyone thinks about that sometimes, Your Highness. But you chose your job, did not you? You decided to become a guard and work here at the palace." "Yes, that is true." Prince George set down his fork and looked directly at Thomas for the first time in 2 days. "What if I told you that I never want to be king?" The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. This was exactly the kind of conversation that palace protocol said he should not engage in. But the pain in the young prince's eyes made it impossible to give a formal response. "Your Highness," Thomas said carefully, "many people have doubts about their future responsibilities when they are young. This is not doubt, Thomas. This is certainty." George's voice was quiet but firm. "I have been thinking about this for months. I do not want the crown. I do not want the responsibilities. I do not want to spend my entire life doing what other people expect me to do." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of royals throughout history who had given up their titles, but never someone so young, and never the direct heir to the throne. "Have you discussed these feelings with your parents, Your Highness?" George laughed, but there was no happiness in the sound. "How can I tell them that everything they have prepared me for, Everything they believe I will become is something I do not want. They would think I have lost my mind. The breakfast continued in silence after that. Thomas watched as Prince George pushed his food around his plate, clearly lost in thought. When it was time to leave for school, George moved like he was walking through thick mud, every step requiring enormous effort. At school, Thomas noticed something different in the way the other students looked at Prince George. Usually they kept a respectful distance, understanding that he was different from them. Today, several classmates approached him with worried expressions, clearly noticing that something was wrong. Through the car window, Thomas watched as George spoke with his friends. The conversation looked serious, and Thomas could see the prince shaking his head repeatedly, as if he was declining offers of help or support. During the school day, Thomas received an unusual phone call from the palace. Prince George's private secretary wanted to know if the prince had mentioned feeling unwell, or if there had been any security concerns. Apparently, George's teachers had called to express worry about his behavior and appearance. Thomas found himself in a difficult position. His job was to report anything unusual that might affect the prince's safety or the royal family's reputation. But he also felt a deep loyalty to George as a person, not just as a royal he was assigned to protect. The conversation they had shared at breakfast felt private and important. "The prince seems tired but has not mentioned any specific concerns," Thomas told the secretary. It was not exactly a lie, but it was not the complete truth either. When school ended, Prince George came out of the building looking even more exhausted than when he had arrived. This time he was alone. His usual group of friends was nowhere to be seen, and he walked to the car like he was carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. During the drive back to the palace, George finally spoke. "Thomas, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, Your Highness." "When you were my age, did you ever feel like your life was not really your own?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "I think most teenagers feel that way sometimes. The difference is that most people get to choose their own path when they become adults." "Exactly," George said quietly. "Most people get to choose." That evening, Prince George again refused dinner and went straight to his room. Thomas remained at his post in the hallway, but this time he was not just worried about the prince's mood. He was beginning to understand that George was planning something significant, something that would change everything. As the night grew later, Thomas heard movement from inside the prince's room. It sounded like George was pacing back and forth, occasionally stopping to open and close drawers or move objects around. Whatever decision the prince was working toward, it seemed like he was getting closer to making it. Thomas barely slept that night. He kept thinking about Prince George's questions and the pain he had seen in the young man's eyes. When he arrived at the palace the next morning, he found an unusual scene waiting for him. Prince George's door was already open, and the prince was sitting in a chair by his window, fully dressed but staring out at the gardens. He had been awake for hours, maybe all night. The bed did not look like it had been slept in at all. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice normal despite his growing concern. George turned to look at him, and Thomas was startled by what he saw. The prince's eyes were red and puffy as if he had been crying, but there was also something else there. A kind of determination that Thomas had never seen before. "Thomas, I need to ask you something very important," George said without returning the greeting. "Yes, Your Highness. If I made a decision that went against everything my family expected of me, but it was the right decision for me as a person, would you support me?" This was exactly the kind of question that Thomas had been trained never to answer. Palace guards were supposed to remain neutral in family matters and political decisions. But looking at the young prince, Thomas found himself thinking more like a caring adult than a royal employee. "Your Highness, I believe that every person deserves to live a life that makes them happy and fulfilled." George smiled for the first time in 3 days. It was a small smile, but it was real. "Thank you, Thomas. That means more to me than you know." They walked to breakfast together, but again George ate very little. This time, however, he seemed more alert and focused. He asked Thomas questions about his own life, his family, and what he had wanted to be when he was young. "I always wanted to be a teacher," Thomas admitted. "I loved the idea of helping young people learn and grow." "Why did you not become one?" "My father was a security guard, and he thought this job would provide better stability for my family. I do not regret the choice, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had followed my original dream." George nodded thoughtfully. So you understand what it feels like to have other people's expectations shape your life path? I suppose I do, though my situation was very different from yours. Not as different as you might think, George said quietly. Later that morning, something unexpected happened. Prince George's parents returned from Scotland earlier than planned. The Prince and Princess of Wales wanted to have lunch with their son, something that would normally make George happy. Today, however, the news seemed to fill him with anxiety. Thomas watched as palace staff hurried to prepare for the impromptu family meal. George retreated to his room and asked not to be disturbed until it was time for lunch. Through the door, Thomas could hear the prince moving around restlessly and occasionally talking to himself in a voice too quiet to understand. When lunchtime arrived, George emerged from his room looking pale but determined. He had changed into more formal clothes and combed his hair carefully, but Thomas could see that his hands were still shaking slightly. The family dining room was beautifully set with the finest china and silver. Prince George's parents were already seated when he arrived, both smiling warmly at their son. They had clearly missed him during their trip to Scotland. "You look tired, darling," his mother said with concern. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am fine, Mother. Just thinking about some important things." His father raised an eyebrow. "Important things such as?" George took a deep breath. Thomas, standing by the door, could see the exact moment when the prince made his final decision about whatever he had been planning. "Father, Mother, I need to tell you something very serious." The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. Both parents put down their forks and gave George their complete attention. "I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about my future and my role in the royal family." "That is natural," his father said encouragingly. "These are important considerations as you prepare for adulthood. I have decided that I do not want to be king." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Prince George's parents stared at their son in shock, clearly unable to process what they had just heard. "I beg your pardon?" his mother said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not want to inherit the crown. I want to give up my place in the line of succession and live a normal life." George's father stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. "George, you cannot be serious. You are 15 years old. You do not understand the implications of what you are saying." "I understand perfectly well," George replied, his voice growing stronger. "I have thought about nothing else for months. I do not want to spend my entire life fulfilling other people's expectations. I want to choose my own career, marry someone I love without worrying about royal approval, and make my own decisions about how to live." Thomas watched as the prince's mother began to cry. She tried to hide it behind her napkin, but her shoulders were shaking with emotion. "Son, this is not just about you," his father said, trying to control his own emotions. "You have responsibilities to the country, to the Commonwealth, to centuries of tradition." "Those are responsibilities that I never chose to accept," George said firmly. "And I should have the right to decline them." The argument that followed was painful to witness. Thomas had never seen the royal family argue before, and he felt like he was intruding on something deeply private. But he could not leave his post, and George seemed to draw strength from his presence. The lunch ended with George's parents saying they needed time to discuss this shocking announcement. The prince was told to go to his room and think very carefully about what he was saying. As the family separated, Thomas could see that this conversation had changed everything between them. Back in his room, Prince George sat in his chair by the window again. This time, however, he seemed calmer and more at peace. "I did it, Thomas," he said softly. "I told them the truth." Thomas did not know what to say. He had just witnessed something that could change the future of the British monarchy. "How do you feel, Your Highness?" George smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "For the first time in months, I feel like myself again." That evening, Thomas received urgent messages from several palace officials requesting meetings about the situation with Prince George. It was clear that news of the lunch conversation was spreading quickly through the royal household. Thomas realized that he was about to be placed in an impossible position between his loyalty to his job and his growing respect for the young prince's courage. The palace was in chaos the next morning. Thomas arrived to find security meetings happening behind closed doors, royal advisors hurrying through corridors with worried expressions, and phone calls being made constantly from the administrative offices. Word of Prince George's declaration had spread throughout the entire royal household. Before Thomas could even reach his usual post, he was intercepted by the head of security, Commander Richards, a stern man with gray hair and cold blue eyes. "Whitmore, I need to speak with you immediately," Richards said, his voice sharp with authority. They walked to a small office that Thomas had never been inside before. Richards closed the door and turned to face him with a serious expression. "I understand you have been the primary guard for Prince George during the past few days when his behavior has been concerning." "Yes, sir. I need you to tell me everything you have observed. Every conversation, every unusual behavior. Anything that might help us understand how the prince developed these ridiculous ideas about abandoning his royal duties." Thomas felt his stomach twist into knots. This was exactly what he had been dreading. "The prince has seemed thoughtful and quiet, sir, but nothing that suggested—" "Do not give me diplomatic answers, Whitmore," Richards interrupted. "The future of the monarchy could be at stake here. Did Prince George discuss his intentions with you before yesterday's lunch?" The direct question hung in the air between them. Thomas knew that lying to his superior officer could cost him his job, but telling the truth might betray Prince George's trust at a time when the young man needed support. "The prince did ask some philosophical questions about choice and responsibility, sir, but I did not realize the extent of his feelings until yesterday." Richard studied Thomas's face carefully. "Philosophical questions? What kind of philosophical questions?" "Questions about freedom, about choosing one's own path in life. The kinds of questions many young people ask." "And how did you respond to these questions?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I tried to be supportive while remaining appropriate to my role, sir." "Supportive?" Richard's voice rose slightly. "Whitmore, your job is to protect the prince, not to encourage him to make decisions that could destroy the royal family." "With respect, sir, I believe supporting the prince's emotional well-being is part of protecting him." Richards walked to the window and stared out at the palace grounds for several minutes before speaking again. "The Prince and Princess of Wales are extremely concerned. They believe their son may be having some kind of psychological crisis. There is talk of bringing in specialists, perhaps even considering whether the prince needs medical intervention." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest. "Medical intervention? Sir, Prince George is not mentally ill. He is a thoughtful young man who is struggling with questions about his future. That is not for you to determine, Whitmore." Richards turned back to face him. "From now on, I want detailed reports on everything Prince George says and does. Every conversation, every mood change, every person he speaks with. Is that understood?" "Sir, with respect, that would require me to spy on the prince. I do not believe that is appropriate." Richard's eyes grew cold. "What you believe is appropriate is irrelevant. You work for the crown, not for Prince George personally. If you cannot fulfill these duties, perhaps we need to assign someone else to this position." The threat was clear. Thomas realized that his job was now in danger because he had shown genuine care for Prince George as a person, rather than just treating him as a royal obligation. "I understand, sir," Thomas said quietly. When Thomas finally reached Prince George's room, he found the young prince sitting at his desk, writing in what appeared to be a journal. George looked up when Thomas entered, and his face immediately showed concern. "You look upset, Thomas. What happened?" Thomas struggled with how to answer. He had just been ordered to spy on the prince, but he also wanted to warn George about what was happening. "There are many people in the palace who are concerned about your decision yesterday, Your Highness." George set down his pen and sighed. "I expected that. Are they trying to convince you to betray my trust?" The question was so direct and perceptive that Thomas was startled. "Your Highness, it is all right, Thomas. I know how these things work. They will pressure everyone around me to report on my behavior and conversations. They will try to make it seem like I am having a mental breakdown rather than making a rational choice about my life." Thomas realized that, despite his young age, Prince George understood the political machinery of the palace better than Thomas had given him credit for. "What they do not understand," George continued, "is that this decision has actually made me feel better than I have felt in years. For the first time, I am being honest about who I am and what I want." That afternoon, Prince George did something he had never done before. Instead of going to school, he asked Thomas to drive him to a public library in central London. This was highly unusual, as royal family members rarely visited public places without extensive security preparations. "Your Highness, I should check with the security office before we make any unscheduled stops." Thomas, if I am going to give up my royal title, I need to start learning how to live like a normal person. That includes going to libraries when I want to research something. Against his better judgment, Thomas drove to the library. He watched nervously as Prince George walked through the entrance like any other teenager, found a table in the corner, and began reading books about constitutional law and the history of royal abdications. For 3 hours, George sat quietly reading and taking notes. Other library visitors occasionally glanced at him with curiosity, perhaps thinking he looked familiar, but no one approached him. Thomas could see how peaceful and focused the prince seemed when he was able to act like a normal person. On the drive back to the palace, George was more talkative than he had been in days. Did you know, Thomas, that there have been several members of royal families throughout history who gave up their titles to live ordinary lives? And most of them reported being much happier afterward. I did not know that, Your Highness. I have been researching this decision for months, not just thinking about it emotionally. I understand the constitutional implications, the political complications, and the media attention it will cause. But I also understand that I have one life to live, and I want to live it as myself, not as a symbol. When they returned to the palace, Thomas was immediately called to another meeting with Commander Richards. Where did you take Prince George this afternoon? There is no record of any approved outings on his schedule. Thomas realized that the palace had been tracking their movements. The prince requested to visit a library, sir. A library? For what purpose? To do research, sir. What kind of research? Thomas hesitated. He knew that his answer would probably get Prince George into more trouble, but he had been ordered to report everything. Research about royal abdications throughout history, sir. Richard's face turned red with anger. And you allowed this? You helped a confused 15-year-old boy research how to abandon his responsibilities to the crown? Sir, the prince seemed calm and rational. I thought it was better for him to educate himself about his options rather than make impulsive decisions. Your job is not to think, Whitmore. Your job is to follow orders and protect the royal family's interests. As Thomas left the meeting, he realized that he was facing an impossible choice. He could continue following orders and help the palace pressure Prince George into abandoning his decision, or he could continue supporting the young man's right to make his own choices about his life. Either way, his career as a royal guard was probably coming to an end. The following morning brought a development that Thomas had not expected. When he arrived at Prince George's room, he found that another guard was already stationed outside the door. The man was someone Thomas had never seen before, older and more intimidating than the usual palace security staff. Excuse me, Thomas said politely. I believe there has been some mistake. This is my assigned post. The other guard looked at him with cold eyes. No mistake. You have been reassigned. Report to Commander Richards immediately. Thomas felt his heart sink. He realized that his conversation with Richards the day before had convinced the palace officials that he could not be trusted to properly monitor Prince George. In Richards's office, Thomas found not just the commander but also 2 other high-ranking palace officials he recognized, but had never spoken with directly. Whitmore, Richards began without any greeting. It has been decided that your close relationship with Prince George has compromised your ability to perform your duties objectively. One of the other officials, a woman with silver hair and a sharp suit, spoke next. We understand that you have developed a personal attachment to the prince, which is natural given the years you have spent in his service. However, the current situation requires guards who can maintain professional distance. Thomas felt like he was being fired, but in the most polite way possible. Sir, ma'am, I have always performed my duties with complete professionalism. Your definition of professionalism appears to include encouraging a minor royal to research ways to abandon his constitutional obligations. Richard said sharply, I did not encourage anything, sir. I simply supervised the prince during an activity he had requested. The third official, an elderly man with thick glasses, leaned forward. Whitmore, you must understand that Prince George is going through a phase. Many young people his age have doubts about their future responsibilities. Our job is to guide him through this confusion, not to enable him to make permanent decisions he will regret. With respect, sir, the prince does not seem confused to me. He seems very clear about what he wants. The room fell silent. Thomas realized that he had just said something that these officials considered very dangerous. That attitude, the woman said coldly, is exactly why you cannot continue in this position. You have been transferred to General Palace Security. You will no longer have any direct contact with Prince George. Thomas felt like he had been punched in the stomach. After 12 years of protecting and caring for the young prince, he was being cut off completely. May I ask who will be taking over the prince's security? That is not your concern, Richards replied. Thomas left the meeting feeling angry and helpless. As he walked through the palace corridors, he thought about Prince George waking up that morning to find a stranger outside his door, instead of the familiar face he had seen every day for years. Despite being banned from his old post, Thomas found ways to check on Prince George from a distance. During his new duties patrolling other areas of the palace, he would sometimes catch glimpses of the prince moving through the corridors with his new guard. What Thomas saw worried him greatly. Prince George looked more isolated and unhappy than ever before. The new guard followed him everywhere but never spoke to him beyond giving orders. There was no friendly conversation, no supportive presence, just cold professional surveillance. Thomas also noticed that Prince George's parents had increased their involvement in his daily schedule. The prince was no longer allowed to make any decisions about his activities or destinations. Every moment of his day was planned and supervised by adults who were clearly trying to prevent him from having any opportunity to pursue his plans for abdication. On the third day of this new arrangement, Thomas was patrolling near the library when he saw something that made his heart race. Prince George was there, but he was not with his official guard. Instead, he was alone, clearly having found a way to slip away from his supervision. Thomas faced an immediate dilemma. His official duty was to report this security breach immediately. Prince George was unsupervised in a public area of the palace, which was against all protocols. But Thomas also knew that reporting this would result in even stricter control over the prince's movements. Instead of calling for backup, Thomas approached the prince quietly. "Your Highness, you should not be here alone." George looked up from the book he was reading, and Thomas was shocked by the change in his appearance. The prince had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that had not been there a few days ago. "Thomas," George said with genuine happiness, "I have missed talking to you." "I have missed you too, Your Highness. But you need to return to your room before someone notices you are missing." "They have me under constant watch now," George said bitterly. "I cannot go anywhere or do anything without someone reporting every detail to my parents and the palace officials. They are treating me like a prisoner." Thomas looked around to make sure they were not being observed. "Your Highness, I know this is difficult, but perhaps you should consider that your parents are acting out of love and concern." George shook his head firmly. "This is not love, Thomas. This is control. They are trying to wear me down until I give up and agree to accept the crown. But I will not change my mind. What do you plan to do?" George closed the book he had been reading and looked directly at Thomas. "I am going to wait until I turn 18, and then I am going to make my abdication official. In the meantime, I am documenting everything that is happening to me. The restrictions, the surveillance, the attempts to pressure me into changing my mind." Thomas felt a chill of fear. "Your Highness, that sounds like you are planning something that could be very dangerous for you." "The only thing that is dangerous is allowing other people to control my entire life," George replied. "Thomas, I need to ask you something important. If I needed help, real help, would you be willing to provide it?" This was the question Thomas had been dreading. The prince was essentially asking him to choose between his loyalty to the royal institution and his loyalty to George as a person. "Your Highness, I am not asking you to do anything illegal or harmful," George continued. "I am asking if you would help me exercise my right to make my own decisions about my life." Thomas looked at the young man he had watched grow up, someone he had come to respect and care about like his own son. Prince George had always been thoughtful, intelligent, and kind. The decision he was making was not the result of confusion or rebellion, but of careful consideration about what kind of life he wanted to live. "Yes, Your Highness," Thomas said quietly. "If you need help, I will provide it." George smiled with relief. "Thank you, Thomas. That means everything to me." As they separated and George returned to his room, Thomas realized that he had just committed himself to a course of action that would probably cost him his job and potentially his freedom. But for the first time since this crisis began, he felt like he was doing the right thing. That evening, Thomas received a message asking him to meet with someone outside the palace. The message was unsigned, but he suspected it was connected to Prince George's situation. As he prepared to leave the palace, Thomas wondered if he was about to become part of something much larger than he had imagined. The meeting was arranged at a small coffee shop in central London, far from the palace and any royal connections. Thomas arrived early, feeling nervous and uncertain about what he was getting himself into. He had never been involved in anything that went against his official duties, and the weight of that decision was heavy on his mind. When Prince George arrived, Thomas was surprised to see that he was not alone. With him was a woman in her 40s, who introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, a constitutional lawyer who specialized in royal law. "Thomas," Prince George said as they sat down at a corner table, "I want you to meet someone who has been helping me understand my legal options." Sarah Mitchell shook Thomas's hand with a firm grip and looked him directly in the eyes. "Mr. Whitmore, Prince George has told me about your support during this difficult time. I want you to know that what he is planning is completely legal and within his rights as a member of the royal family." Thomas felt some relief at hearing this, but he was still confused about exactly what the plan involved. "Your Highness, perhaps, you could explain what you are hoping to accomplish?" Prince George took a deep breath before speaking. "Thomas, I have been working with Sarah to prepare a formal declaration of abdication. According to British constitutional law, I have the right to renounce my claim to the throne, even as a minor, as long as I have proper legal representation and can demonstrate that I understand the consequences of my decision." Sarah opened a briefcase and pulled out several thick documents. "I have been researching this for months, ever since Prince George first contacted me. There is clear precedent for royal abdications, and the law does not require him to wait until he becomes king to make this choice." Thomas looked through some of the papers, though much of the legal language was difficult for him to understand. "What would this mean practically?" "It would mean that I would officially give up my place in the line of succession," George explained. "My sister Charlotte would become the heir apparent and I would be free to live as a private citizen. But surely this would require approval from your parents and other officials." Sarah shook her head. "Actually, it does not. The decision to abdicate is considered a personal right that cannot be overruled by family members or government officials. The only requirement is that the person making the decision is mentally competent and fully informed about the consequences." Thomas began to understand why the palace had been so concerned about Prince George's research and why they had increased their control over his activities. "The problem," George continued, "is that I need to be able to present this declaration publicly. As long as I am under constant surveillance and control, I cannot hold the press conference that would be necessary to make the abdication official." "This is where you come in, Mr. Whitmore," Sarah said. "Prince George needs someone he trusts to help him get to the location where the press conference will be held without being stopped by palace security." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "You are asking me to help the prince escape from the palace?" "Not escape," George said firmly. "I am not running away or disappearing. I am asking for help to exercise my legal right to address the public about my decision. After the press conference, I will return to the palace and face whatever consequences come from my choice." Thomas looked at the determination in Prince George's eyes and realized that this was not an impulsive teenage rebellion. This was a carefully planned, legally sound decision made by someone who had thought through every aspect of what he was doing. "What exactly would you need me to do?" Sarah pulled out a map and pointed to several locations. "There is a hotel in central London where we have arranged for the press conference. Prince George needs to be there tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. The media has been contacted and will be waiting." "How would we get there without being detected?" "That is what we need to figure out," George said. "You know the palace security systems better than anyone. Is there a way for me to leave the building without immediately triggering alarms and pursuit?" Thomas thought carefully about the palace layout and security protocols. There were several service entrances that were less heavily monitored, and he knew the timing of guard rotations throughout the day. "There might be a way," he said slowly. "But, Your Highness, you must understand that once you do this, there will be no going back. Your relationship with your family will be permanently changed." George's expression became sad but remained determined. "Thomas, my relationship with my family is already damaged. They are not speaking to me as their son anymore, only as a future king who is malfunctioning. If I go through with this, at least there is a chance that eventually they will be able to love me for who I actually am, not for the role they want me to play. The meeting continued for another hour as they worked out the details of the plan. Thomas would help Prince George leave the palace during a shift change the next afternoon. Sarah would be waiting with a car to take him to the press conference. After making his public declaration, George would return to the palace to face his family and the consequences of his choice. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah handed Thomas a business card. "Mr. Whitmore, I want you to know that you are helping a young man exercise his fundamental human rights. What the palace is doing, keeping him under surveillance and trying to pressure him into accepting a role he does not want, could be considered a form of psychological abuse." Thomas had never thought about Prince George's situation in those terms, but he realized that Sarah was right. Despite his royal status, George was still a 15-year-old boy who deserved the right to make decisions about his own future. That evening, Thomas returned to the palace with a heavy heart. He spent his shift thinking about what he was planning to do the next day. For 12 years, he had been completely loyal to the royal family and the institution they represented. Tomorrow, he would be helping one member of that family rebel against everything the institution stood for. But as Thomas thought about Prince George's situation, he realized that his loyalty had always been to the people he protected, not to the abstract concept of the monarchy. If helping George meant betraying the palace officials who wanted to control him, then Thomas was prepared to make that choice. Late that night, Thomas wrote a letter explaining his actions and his reasoning. He did not plan to deliver it until after the press conference, but he wanted to have his thoughts clearly documented. The letter explained that he was not acting out of disloyalty to the crown, but out of loyalty to a young man's right to determine his own life path. As Thomas sealed the letter, he wondered if tomorrow would be the last day he ever worked as a royal guard. But he also knew that it might be the first day that Prince George would truly be free to become himself. The next morning arrived gray and rainy, which seemed appropriate for what was about to happen. Thomas took his position at his new post, but his mind was entirely focused on the plan they had made. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, everything would change for both him and Prince George forever. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, Thomas received the text message he had been waiting for. "Ready. Library in 5 minutes." His heart was pounding as he made his way through the palace corridors toward the library where Prince George would be waiting. Thomas had spent the morning carefully observing the security rotations and confirming that the service exit he had identified would be unmonitored for exactly 12 minutes during the shift change. When Thomas arrived at the library, he found Prince George sitting calmly at a desk, reading the same constitutional law book he had been studying for weeks. The prince looked up with a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. "Are you certain about this, Your Highness?" Thomas asked one final time. George closed the book and stood up with quiet dignity. "Thomas, I have never been more certain about anything in my life. This is not about rejecting my family or my country. This is about claiming the right to be authentic about who I am." They walked together through the palace corridors for what both men knew might be the last time. Thomas felt the weight of 12 years of shared history between them. He had watched this young man grow from a child into someone capable of making one of the most difficult decisions imaginable. The service corridor was empty when they reached it, exactly as Thomas had predicted. The exit led to a loading dock area where delivery trucks usually parked. Today, Sarah Mitchell was waiting in a plain black car with the engine running. "Your Highness?" Thomas said as they reached the door. "Once you walk through here, everything changes. For both of us." Prince George turned to face Thomas with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thomas, you have been more than a guard to me. You have been a friend and a mentor. What you are doing today takes tremendous courage." "You are the one showing courage, Your Highness. I am just making sure you have the opportunity to use it." George stepped toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Thomas, will you come with me to the press conference? I would like to have someone there who believes in what I am doing." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your Highness, that would mean leaving my post completely. I would be abandoning my duties. You would be choosing to support my right to abandon mine." In that moment, Thomas realized that this was the choice he had been avoiding for days. He could help Prince George escape and then return to the palace to face the consequences while maintaining some level of professional distance. Or he could make a complete commitment to supporting the prince's decision, even if it meant the end of his career. Looking at Prince George's hopeful face, Thomas made his final decision. "Yes, Your Highness. I will come with you." Together, they walked out of the palace and into Sarah Mitchell's car. As they drove away from the only workplace Thomas had known for 12 years, he felt a strange mixture of fear and liberation. The hotel where the press conference was scheduled was in central London, far from the royal residences. Sarah had chosen it specifically because it was neutral ground where Prince George could speak freely, without the intimidating presence of palace security. During the drive, George was quiet and focused, reviewing the speech he had prepared. Thomas watched the familiar London streets pass by the window and thought about how different everything would be after today. When they arrived at the hotel, Thomas was amazed by the number of reporters and cameras waiting outside. News of an unexpected announcement from Prince George had spread quickly through the media, and everyone was speculating about what he might say. Inside the hotel conference room, more than 50 journalists were seated with cameras and recording equipment ready. Sarah had arranged for the event to be broadcast live on television, ensuring that Prince George's words would reach the entire country immediately. As they prepared to enter the room, Prince George took Thomas aside for a private moment. "Thomas, I want you to know that whatever happens after today, I will never forget what you have done for me. You could have followed orders and tried to stop me. Instead, you chose to help me become who I need to be. Your Highness, you helped me remember something important too. Sometimes loyalty means supporting someone's right to make their own choices, even when those choices are difficult." Prince George smiled with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." The press conference itself was remarkable in its simplicity and dignity. Prince George walked to the podium wearing a simple suit instead of his usual formal royal attire. He looked directly into the cameras and spoke with a calm, clear voice. "My name is George Alexander Lewis, and I am 15 years old. I am here today to announce my decision to formally abdicate my claim to the British throne." The room erupted with questions and camera flashes, but George continued speaking with remarkable composure. "This decision has not been made lightly or impulsively. I have spent months studying the constitutional law surrounding royal abdication, and I have consulted with legal experts to ensure that I understand the full implications of my choice." He went on to explain his reasoning with maturity that impressed even Thomas, who had watched him prepare for this moment. George spoke about his desire to serve his country in different ways, his belief that the monarchy would be stronger with someone who truly wanted the responsibility, and his hope that his decision would demonstrate that even members of the royal family should have the right to determine their own paths in life. "I love my family and I love my country," George concluded. "But I believe that true service comes from authenticity, not obligation. I hope that by making this choice I can contribute to a monarchy that represents the best values of modern Britain, including the principle that every person should be free to choose their own destiny." The questions from reporters were intense and sometimes hostile, but Prince George answered each one with thoughtful precision. Thomas watched with pride as the young man he had helped protect for so many years demonstrated incredible strength and grace under pressure. After the press conference ended, Thomas and Prince George sat together in Sarah's car for a few minutes before returning to the palace. Both men knew that they were about to face severe consequences for their actions. "Do you regret what we did today?" George asked. Thomas thought carefully before answering. "Your Highness, I regret that it was necessary, but I do not regret helping you find the courage to be honest about who you are." When they arrived back at the palace, they were met by a crowd of security officials, government representatives, and very angry members of the royal family. Thomas was immediately separated from Prince George and taken into custody for questioning. The next several hours were the most difficult of Thomas's life. He was interrogated repeatedly about his role in helping Prince George escape, his motivations for betraying his duties, and his connections to the constitutional lawyer who had helped plan the press conference. But even as Thomas faced the end of his career and possible criminal charges, he felt no regret about his choice. He had watched a thoughtful, intelligent young man find the courage to live authentically, and he had been honored to help make that possible. Prince George's abdication was officially accepted within a week, making him the youngest member of the British royal family ever to voluntarily give up a claim to the throne. The decision sparked national and international debate about tradition, individual rights, and the future of monarchy in the modern world. Thomas was dismissed from royal service but was not charged with any crimes. As he cleaned out his small office at the palace, he received a handwritten note from George, who had returned to using his full name rather than his royal title. "Dear Thomas," the note read, "thank you for helping me learn that true loyalty sometimes means having the courage to step away from duty when duty conflicts with doing what is right. I will never forget your friendship and support during the most important decision of my life." Thomas folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. As he walked out of the palace for the last time, he felt proud of the choice he had made. Sometimes stepping away from duty was the most dutiful thing a person could do.